Hello again, and welcome to week 3 of our time together. This time we're looking at the underpinnings of our contemporary world, the revolution of ideas that leads to the apparent ascendancy of what historians call liberalism. That is, the expansion of participation in the body politic and the changing from a medieval or feudal order to a more modernist participatory order. This is not a change that is granted or guaranteed by any stretch of the imagination, and like many revolutions, can still be unseated as the forces of simplistic ideas, brutalism, exclusionism, and faux populism crop up like weeds, threatening to choke out the garden of our modern democracies. Before we proceed, I want to look at some of the words that we'll need to be familiar with as we go on. Of course, because this is a 5-week class, it is a necessity that we kind of pare down the broad scope of the Enlightenment to a more manageable size. The Enlightenment was a wave of intellectual change that upended, questioned, complicated, and added nuance to all human interactions. From how we should treat each other to how we should view religion, and of course, how we should govern ourselves. This latter part, which for our purposes we will call political philosophy, becomes a hotbed of debate in the 18th and 19th century, and beyond, mind you. And it is a subset of philosophical inquiry that asks the fundamental question of the purpose of government, the nature of power, and of course the rights of people. This is not as cut and dried as you would like, though. Remember, in this environment, the idea that anyone outside of the landed elite and monarchies should have any say in government is deeply seditious and even anathema to religious teachings. It is as good as a death sentence to say that the king isn't literally put in charge by God, or that the basis of your happiness is not the providence of the fickle finger of fate, but your own hard work. Imagine how much more rebellious and dangerous it is to say that no one religious practice has a monopoly on truth and thus should not be held higher than any other. In that kind of environment, yeah, you're not long for this world. These questions and many, many more topics lead us inevitably to the Atlantic revolutions, the period in the 18th and 19th century, and again beyond, that upend the geopolitical order and establish independent countries from formerly beholden colonies or lands. While the circumstances of each revolution is nuanced and complex enough to fuel an entire career as a political scientist, a historian, an economist, or even a philosopher, we'll just be looking briefly at the surface of a few influential events, people, and thoughts that lead to the era of Atlantic revolutions. As I've done in prior lectures, we're going to again jump a wee bit into the past before our arbitrary 1500 start date and look at the Gutenberg printing press. Though printing presses existed as far back as the Roman period, his was the first to use movable type, well, at least in Europe. Chinese printers had been using similar presses in their own society, but it had its own issues and was never really exported even to its close neighbors. So, in a nutshell, this is an ambitious endeavor and one that would have implications for the modern world that no one could have predicted at the time. The printing press, though it didn't remain Gutenberg's device for long, it's this huge tragic story full of unscrupulous investors and betrayal and disappointment and heartbreak. It nonetheless made information abundant. Within a decade of its debut, over 1 million books were printed on a printing press or its clones. The expansion became exponential. 2 million within 5 more years, 25 million within just 2 more years of that, and so on. Movable type brought down the cost of printing, made it faster, cheaper, and more importantly, more legible. This allowed for the dissemination of books and, of course, also made newspapers possible. It made revolutionary broadsheets, the kind of long form tweets of their day, possible. Revolutionary pamphlets, propaganda leaflets, religious theses, royal proclamations alike were not only prolific but nearly disposable. Most importantly, the printing press was not suppressed by the Catholic Church. In fact, it was welcomed even though it threatened many a monk's livelihood. Why? Well, the church saw this as a possibility to expand the priesthood, to make it more possible for more people to learn to be priests. So, you think that's unimportant? Imagine the catastrophe that would take place in your life if suddenly you were cut away from all your electronic devices. No cell phone, no computer, no television, no radio, nothing. How would you know what's happening in the world? How would you know what's happening in your country? How would you know what's happening in your city? You would be absolutely blind to the rest of the world. And that's the world into which the printing press is born. Now, news is not just local. It is regional. It is countrywide. It is global. While the printing press is one element of our foundational cement, the other is an expanding what we call middling sort that emerged during the Renaissance. Bankers, merchants, and professionals who didn't really fall neatly into the medieval categories of aristocrat or not aristocrat, basically. They had way too much money to be peasants or laborers, and not enough heritage or affluent blood to be considered landed elite. So while the Renaissance's Medici family and other city-state bankers are much diminished by the time we get to the 18th century, the expansion of trade makes other people in other countries just as wealthy, if not more so. This middling sort, what we'd kind of call a kind of precursor to the middle class, were expanding. Now, more people had more money, they were less concerned with day-to-day survival and could afford to take time off to read and educate themselves and their children. They could even send their children to schools and universities. And more importantly, for our purposes, they could debate in gatherings with like-minded people in situations that we call salons. We're borrowing a French term here. These informal gatherings were very popular in the 19th century and before. Though they started with the manor houses of well-to-do merchants and professionals, they also began to seep out into the wider society, replicating themselves in a more informal way in taverns and coffee shops around the world. Fierce debates over rights and governance and religion and economic theory were held in posh estates and in the street alike. During the 19th century, coffee houses were such regular places of revolutionary activity, people smoking cigarettes, drinking these endless cups of coffee, reading newspapers aloud to each other, and debating loudly that French, Turkish, English, Russian, and other imperial authorities would occasionally shut these places down and forbid such gatherings. So we have this great mix of expanding trade, increased affluence, better education, easy replicable ideas that are disseminated widely. In the 18th and 19th century, instead of a barrier like it was in the 15th or 16th century, the Atlantic Ocean becomes a kind of highway of sorts, where people and ideas flow as easily as trade or rum or guns or tobacco. Adding to this is the kind of uneven attention some colonies are paid by the home country. Particularly in North America, the English and to a lesser degree the French colonies are pretty much left alone to govern themselves. This independence and disinterested administration leads to the building of resentment when the old world suddenly wants to exert a wider control, particularly after the Seven Years' War. This kind of resentment we could liken to a teenager that might have um, anger against a kind of absent parent who suddenly gets super involved in their business. Compare that to the Caribbean and parts of Latin America that we refer to as the Spanish Main. So the northern part of South America, the Mexican coast, Cuba, Hispaniola, what will become later on Puerto Rico. Uh, and we see that those areas are actually much more profitable. And so they were paid much more attention. When they were paid more attention, it meant that the revolutions in these places were delayed or, in some cases, never really happened at all in their own right. We're going to carry forward that analogy of the parent, and if the North American child is the neglected teenager, then the Caribbean was the favored child who kind of was helicopter parented to the point where rebellion was difficult, if not impossible. While it might be tempting to see trade and the expansion of wealth as the prime motivator for revolution, it really wasn't. While the well-to-do flirted with these revolutionary ideas, especially the expansion of political rights to those who were wealthy, it was the poorest who had the least to lose and thus were more inclined to burn it all down in favor of radical ideas like universal enfranchisement, the ending of slavery, or even the destruction of older orders. But I'm getting kind of ahead of myself. So, what were these ideas? Who was saying what? Well, let's focus really quickly on a few so you get an idea of what we're talking about. First up is John Locke. An English philosopher, Locke thought long and hard about the human condition and through debates and discussions with his peers eventually settled on some profoundly disturbing and pernicious ideas. First, he established that everyone in the world was endowed naturally, not through the decree of a king or a papal bull, but naturally with the right to safeguard their lives, their freedom, and their own property. He was essentially saying that it was natural to fight against being murdered, even if the king sends out guards and calls for you to die. And it's also natural to resist being imprisoned, even if the church wants to throw you in prison for heresy. He also said it was an individual's work, not the largesse of a lord, a lady, a bishop, or an abbot, or anybody, that made property rights inviolable. It was, after all, your hard work that brought that field into being, that purchased that table, that bought that horse, that built that house. The others had nothing to do with it, so why should they demand that you give it over? Here he's establishing in a very roundabout way the notion of private property. A sneak peek here, this is such a fundamental given today in Western liberal societies that no government can take away your land, leaving you destitute, but they must compensate you for it, even if they do wind up taking it away eventually. This idea of eminent domain being that, yes, the state may have a need for that land, but you purchased that land, and so you have an inherent right that they need to compensate you for. The idea is very radical. It is audacious. Under a more medieval kind of feudal model, you hold land or whatever, a horse, chair, you name it, because the king or his surrogates gives you permission to. Theoretically, that tacit permission can be taken away at any moment with no recourse or compensation for any reason. That's why some people could be imprisoned for life without facing charges. Why they could have their house taken away, their castle taken away, their horses, their fields. But why? Well, in the medieval mindset, the people in charge were just inherently better people. Well, why were they better people? Well, they're better because they're in charge. I know it sounds circular, right? You're in charge because you're better, and you're better because you're in charge. Yeah, it's complete nonsense. And Locke thought so too. He argued radically that all people are born a tabula rasa, or a blank slate. In theory, anyone can become great or can fall short on their own merits, not because they're born with some mystical bloodline of greatness. His radical stances were so unthinkable, so revolutionary, and his ideas were causing so much unrest that Locke had to flee England in the middle of the night and sought refuge in the Netherlands. He remained and he stayed in the Netherlands for the rest of his life because had he come back, he would have been put on trial for treason, heresy, and a whole host of other charges that were just waiting for him back home. His writings, however, did have an impact. Many philosophers took up his arguments and debated them, expanded upon them, and came up with their own complementary or sometimes contradictory ideas. The genie, so to speak, was already out of the bottle. One such influenced philosopher was Francois-Marie Arouet, also known as Voltaire. A satirist and philosopher, he constantly took pains to deflate the egos of the aristocracy, the Catholic Church, and the monarchy of France. He argued that a truly great society does not censor speech by governmental or religious interference, that the free flow of ideas would serve only to better a society. Good ideas become the norm. Bad ideas, even if they seem fashionable or popular in their day, would eventually rot and fall away from critique and debate. He took this idea a step further, even, and argued that just like this rhetorical homogeneity was a recipe for disaster, so too was religious uniformity. No one religious interpretation holds a monopoly on truth and morality. Some ideas are bad, some are good, and the only way for a society and indeed a religion to flourish is to debate these in an open forum. He was at the time writing against the suppression of French Protestants in France, because it was a majority Catholic society. He argued that the Protestants had some good arguments, and to punish them for critiquing the corruption of the Catholic Church serves only to entrench corruption and make the resentment that corruption engenders more deep-seated. His critique of the church and state repression of the Protestants was an early argument for the separation of church and state. The laws of man and of society, he argued, should be based on rational ideas, not religious dogma. Religious dogma was emotional. Laws should be logical, not emotional. Furthermore, by favoring one religion, or at least one interpretation of one religion, the society becomes weak, fearful, closed-minded, oppressive, and rotten. For his stances, as well as for his penchant of insulting spoiled, rich, landed elites, he faced a choice. He could be imprisoned in life he could be imprisoned for life without trial, or he could just take exile to England. It took him a little while. It actually took him about 6 months before he decided that maybe living in England wasn't so bad. While living in England, he continued his writings and became a pen pal with a young man named Benjamin Franklin, who himself would have a huge role to play in the revolutions to come. The last revolutionary philosopher we'll focus on is Adam Smith, a Scottish philosopher who looked at the morality of money making. He was the first real writer that undertook to examine the underlying principles for economic development and began teasing out the best courses of action. Of course, his was a theory, it wasn't really tested. His first critique was against the monopolization of trade by a select favored few, those in partnership with government or who had undue influence over the government that could hold exclusive control of goods and services and thus hold the wider populace hostage, a kind of slavery that only enriched a few and not the many. He advocated instead for free markets. Though currently interpreted as unrestrained by government interference whatsoever, no regulations, regulations equal bad, Smith didn't actually make that argument. Yeah, he argued that government participation in economics through partnership was a bad idea. He did not argue that government had to take a hands-off approach. He instead said that the government had an obligation to prevent monopolies and to foster small entrepreneurs who would be more innovative, more efficient, and would be able to spread the wealth more equitably. I wonder what he would think of Google, Facebook, Disney, and defense contractors. Some of his critics, and even some of his later devotees, would misunderstand his motivation for arguing for capitalism. While in his book, The Wealth of Nations, he does argue for what we can term enlightened self-interest or greed, if we're being honest. In his earlier work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, he argues that the best entrepreneur isn't motivated exclusively by greed, but rather by doing right by his employees, his customers, and his community. Only when the entrepreneur does that will a free market flourish. His remarks, of course, were heavily critiqued, especially by those who argue that capitalism asks the individual to think about money over what is right, what is fair, or what is equitable. Indeed, his ideas do leave open misinterpretations of capitalism and how it could be applied, and he was satirized into near obscurity for them. So what does all of this mean to you and me? I thought we were going to talk about revolutions, right? Well, just as the revolution of exploration didn't come out of nowhere, and the revolution of trade didn't suddenly spring into being, so too the revolution of revolutions didn't pop out of thin air either. The Enlightenment laid the foundation for a lot of profound, very scary questions. What is the role of government? How do we order our society? What about fairness and equity? What does freedom even mean? What role should religion play? And who benefits from this new economic paradigm? These are not nothing questions, and they have no real easy answers. For example, our current economic situation is not unlike that of the 19th century. Sure, the economy seems to be expanding as a whole, but wages are relatively flat. People are employed, certainly, but they're earning less than they did a decade ago. So, who is benefiting from the expanding economy? Who should benefit from it? How does our concerns about our economic comfort influence our views of racial issues, religious issues, ideas of fairness, and ideas of the government? Might we see another revolution in the next 5 years? Maybe 10 years? 50 years? Why? Why not? Why wouldn't we see another revolution? Turning back to the 18th and 19th century, we might have a clue. The middling sort we talked about a bit ago, they argued that their increase in wealth should allow them to influence the government more, that they are invested sort of in the direction of the country and in a range of policies. They want a huge shakeup in the power sharing status quo of their homeland. But don't mistake their demands for anything radical, at least not in their eyes. To the middle class of England, France, Russia, and other places, they were not the radicals in any sense. They wanted a nice, slow, incremental advancement that allowed for just a few more voices in government. They didn't want to expand the rights to everyone, just them. A few more. What could it harm? But who do they leave behind? At a glance, it seems like they are leaving behind a large majority of many unlucky who see that they have no say in their government. These few are arguing for small incremental changes, that they be included in the elite and not everyone else. So the others are left wondering, well, why not us? Is it any wonder that these middling sorts will be replaced by a more angry, more violent force? At the heart of the expansion of liberalism are some really difficult questions. For example, political rights. Sure, the middle classes were all for expanding rights and protecting citizens, but they stopped short of complete equality. The middle classes are now faced with a complicated question. To whom are these rights guaranteed? What was the minimum requirement of property to be included? What about the middle class who fall just short of that property line, so to speak? Why should the man who runs two businesses be any more free than the man who only runs one, or the man who runs none? How about the woman who owns a three-bedroom house? Would she have no protections, but her sister who owns four bedrooms is fine? So, what are we saying? Are we saying that wealth equals worth? Whatever happened to that tabula rasa, that clean slate? The underpinning of the middle class argument for the expansion of rights to them. Even more difficult is the question of what to do uh, with this concept of universal. Do we mean all men? Do we mean all white men? Do we mean all white people? Is it a gradient of color that comes with rights? What about slaves? If we assert that all men are created equal, how can we allow some to be owned and others not? What form should the future take? What about liberty? Who enjoys the fruits of a free society? What about equality? What are some more equal than others? Is that fair? Can some be more equal than others in an equal society? Or is nobody above or below the law? And what about brotherhood, fraternity? If God created all humans and endowed them with inalienable rights, that is, rights that cannot be taken away by a man, then why are some treated so poorly? Don't we have an obligation handed down to us to help the poor, the sick, the immigrant, the powerless, the orphan, the widow, the elderly? It's these questions and the attempt to answer them, as well as the failures to address some of them, that makes revolutions in the 18th and 19th centuries happen. Some societies, as the American colonies that would eventually become the United States, see a revolution of elite ideas, these highfalutin philosophies that made populist propaganda that would see the colonies of North America cede from her British parents. Some societies, such as the French, would see the masses rise up, angered and exhausted at the unequal distribution of wealth, prosperity, and even food. They would throw down the repressive monarchy, but eventually devolve into internecine civil war, exchanging the rule of a king for the rule of a fickle mob, which in turn allows for the rise of an authoritarian emperor. France does go through many revolutions in the 19th century, and some could even argue never really gets it right. Other societies, such as Haiti, would see slaves rise up in an attempt to throw off their shackles. Though Haiti remains the only successful slave revolution, it is not the only one. Gabriel's Rebellion, Nat Turner's Rebellion in the United States, for example, show how fragile the institution of slavery really is in this new liberal world order. Latin America, though late to the game, would also eventually throw off Spanish crown rule, exchanging a distant authoritarian for more homegrown authoritarians. Despite the dreams of democratic rule by luminaries such as Simon Bolivar, the Latin American countries by and large become ironically anti-liberal, even after leveraging liberalist ideas to motivate the people for revolution. Revolutions don't stop in the 19th century either. They certainly didn't remain confined to the Atlantic world, but we'll cover that more next week. In closing, I want you to look over the text, especially the additional resources, with this idea in mind. How do we, as Americans, ourselves born in a liberal revolution, see revolutions? How do we, beneficiaries of liberalist ideas, see liberalist ideas? Keep in mind that revolutions are really tricky things. They can crop up and can dramatically upend the world as we know it. Ideas are difficult things to kill, and while the printing press, and indeed printing material itself, may be old hat, don't forget that for good or for ill, we are living in what people call the information age. Good information and bad information, good ideas and bad ideas, good intentions and malicious intentions are all out there right at our fingertips, ready to take hold in our minds. Before we know it, we may be making great strides towards a more equal world, or just as easily participate in plunging it into a more revolutionary one. So take care, read carefully, and I'll see you again next week.